everyone and welcome back to my channel. So I'm going to carry on from where I left off last time, discussing the changing concept of autism, the article by Francesca Happe and Uta Frith. So I got up to number 7 on their list of changes to the autism concept since the 1980s. Number 7 is from developmental disorder to neurodivergence. So this describes the shift from a purely medical model to a more social model. This has happened particularly rapidly in the last decade. The traditional notion that autism is a disorder defined purely by deficits inherent to the person has been challenged. Instead, autism is considered a difference, neurodivergence, and constitutes a disability in the context of the demands made by a neurotypical world. And the dimensional conception has no natural cut-off point where high autism traits become autism. Now, you know my views on this. I thoroughly disagree. To me, autism is a disorder. To me, autism is a deficit. To me, autism is a disability. Because if it wasn't, right, you wouldn't go and get a diagnosis, would you? And while I can see that parts of that the social model has its uses. I'm not opposed to the social model. The social model has its place. No one's going to argue, surely, against making sure that the person is put in the best environment for them, that their needs are met. That the demands made by the environment are reduced so that they can live the best possible life within the constraints of their condition, or disorder, I would say. No one's going to, should be arguing against that. That's the social model. I mean, that's just common sense. But that doesn't invalidate the medical model. Certainly the medical model used on its own, saying everything is the person, we're not going to make any allowances for this, is obviously oppressive, and no one in their right mind, unless they weren't a very nice person, would go along with that. But that doesn't mean that we throw the whole medical model out just because it has been abused, and just because some people in the past have interpreted it in that way, that that we just point the finger at the person, not going to change the environment, that is all the person and everything, and we need to fix the person and everything. That's just one way of interpreting a medical model. It's far more balanced to have a kind of medical social synthesis where you say, okay, both have their place. Let's see how they fit for this particular individual. Take a very kind of individualised approach, because it's obviously going to vary tremendously between different individuals, the extent to which they're impaired by their innate biology versus the environment. Some people, it really will be more social model that applies to them. Usually those who are less innately impaired to begin with, just make a few tweaks here and there, put them in a good environment, provide them with what they need, and they might no longer experience themselves as disabled, even though they are still disabled if you removed those accommodations. The point being that some people, you provide these accommodations and they can thrive, and that clearly shows how for some people the social model really does apply. For others, you can give them the best environment, which is still really important, even in those who are very severely impacted. It's very important to give them the best possible environment, because it's still going to help them, it's still going to make them less distressed, it's still going to give them the best possible outcome given given the limitations of their condition, their disorder. But one has to be realistic. For some people, you can do all that, you can provide them with the best possible environment, and yet they will still end up very innately impaired. And that shows how for them, the medical model also applies. So you can't, it's so black and white, it's so binary, so reactionary, so simplistic to say that just one model applies, because it depends on the individual, doesn't it? But I would say that in order for autism to be autism, in order for autism to have any meaning, it should always be understood as a disability. And for different individuals, that disability will be more socially mediated or more medically mediated, depending on the impact, if you like, the intensity of their core autism features. But every single autistic person, regardless of how innately impacted they are, it should always be a disability. If it's not a disability, either socially or medically mediated or both, if it's not a disability, it ain't autism as far as I'm concerned. And I think that we need to be very clear on that. Because there's a tendency in the neurodiversity movement now for people to say, oh, I don't really see myself as disabled. And that's just really dangerous. But I'll take a whole other video, the whole way that disabilities have been euphemised, as if it's a dirty word, which actually, whenever you try and euphemize something, you just end up compounding the stigma. It's like saying it's a dirty word, we mustn't talk about it. It's actually ableism, but I'll take a whole other video. As far as I'm concerned, say the word, hashtag say the word. There's actually been a campaign, say the word, disability is not a bad word, to show this. Now, she goes on to say in the article that in the DSM-5, the diagnosis requires traits cause clinically significant impairment. But if impairment is a function of interaction between persons' characteristics and the demands of the environment, this means an autism diagnosis based on the current behavioural assessments could in theory come and go. Some person may live happily with autistic traits in one context or one age when they find a niche, but be impaired by them in another context that is less accommodating. Can autism come and go? So that's a question. Do we need a term for autism or high autistic traits that are not impairing? Not a diagnosis, but a cognitive style or personality type? I actually think, yeah, we do. I think that autism, what I call autism proper or autism major, whether that be verbal autism or non-verbal autism, should always be innately impairing. And I feel that if you can basically make someone's environment fit them so much that all of their impairments disappear, like completely, as far as I'm concerned, that's not autism. And I think I do understand that there could be a group of people who have a high number of autistic traits, and that they're only impaired by them when their environment isn't making allowances for them, and all it might take is just a few accommodations, and then they can absolutely flourish. And I suppose, in theory, these people might move in and out of a diagnosis. I guess these would be kind of like borderline cases or threshold cases, threshold at the boundaries of normality cases. It would only apply to people like that. And that's a philosophical quandary, isn't it? Is it possible to move in and out of a diagnosis? But like I said, I think that would only apply to a small group of people who are at the borderlines between clinical autism and just having a high number of autistic traits. So the question there would be, should these people be given a distinct, description of having a cognitive style or personality type, maybe like an autistic personality, but stopping short of actually having clinical autism or something like that, or like a broader phenotype situation? Should they be given a separate description? Some of them might not even need an official diagnosis, but should there be something there for them to kind of describe their experience and make sense of their experience, but without kind of using the same term that's given to those who are more severely impaired, because that could obviously result in confusion. That's a question, really, isn't it, at the end of the day? I find it quite hard to understand how someone's impairment could literally completely disappear, even in a very supportive environment. I mean, it is true that obviously the extent of the impairment will vary for all individuals depending on the environment. Even those who are more severely impaired, put them in a good environment, they're obviously going to be less impaired than they might be, say, in an environment that isn't so suited to their needs. But the impairment will still be there, nonetheless. And there's also another question as to how we measure impairment. Is impairment a subjective feeling, or is it an objective, something that's noticed from the outside? So does the person necessarily have to feel impaired themselves for it? Because I don't think they do, because I can give an example, because obviously when I was a child growing up back in the 90s, outside, in terms of like how I was objectively measured, like by educational psychologists, by teachers, and people like monitoring me from the outside, I was severely impaired. I mean, that word was actually used, like severe, in my educational psychology report when I was 9. So from the outside looking in, I was severely impaired, and yet I didn't experience that as an impairment. I was a happy child, and I didn't experience myself as impaired. I mean, I didn't have a language back then, you don't as a child, do you? But I was a happy child, I didn't experience myself as impaired. Subjectively, I was fine, but for others looking in at me, they could see that I was objectively impaired because, I wasn't learning in the way expected and, all these other things. But then as I got older, objectively speaking, my impairment reduced somewhat, because you learn sort of like compensatory strategies. So objectively speaking, as I got older, my impairment reduced. And yet subjectively speaking, I feel now extremely impaired, even though, obviously I am in some ways also because I've developed OCD, which I didn't have as a child, and I think the OCD has meant that subjectively I experience it more impaired, because obviously when you have any mental mental illness or whatever, it obviously, in and of itself, results in a feeling of inner discontent, doesn't it, in and of itself. And obviously when I was a child and I hadn't yet developed these additional comorbids, if you want to call it that, obviously I felt subjectively more at ease, even though objectively speaking my impairment on the autism side of things was a lot worse, I suppose, because I hadn't, although I question that actually. I mean, I think again it comes down to like how it's measured, because I think in terms of like external appearances I was more impaired, but then again I think although I have learned some strategies as I got older, I'm still very socially impaired. It's just that I don't appear, it's just that maybe I've learned, it doesn't come across so much maybe to others. But anyway, that'll take a whole video. So yeah, so how do you measure it? That's the other question. But anyway, I'm diverging a bit here. So yeah, some important questions about how we recognise autism in women and how far we would allow their phenotypes to stray from our textbook cases and still be called autism. Indeed, because I see that a lot now as well, like this whole kind of like people are wanting to create this kind of like female autism, and I don't think there's any such thing personally. Like, I don't think autism differs that markedly between men and women. Like, obviously you're going to see the usual differences between men and women that you might see in the general population, although I actually think in autism those differences should actually be less, because you find a higher tendency for autistics to be non-binary or gender fluid and not to be so kind of socially following the gender norms. So I think you'd actually find less differences between autistic men and women than you would find in the general population between men and women, personally, just based on the fact that obviously non-binary is a lot higher in autism and gender fluidity and stuff. I don't think female autism exists. I'm not saying that there aren't any differences between how autism presents on average between men and women, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that I don't think that we could put it in a box and say there's such a thing as female autism. And this whole way of kind of trying to create this new type of autism, which really differs from the original textbook descriptions, if you ask me, I call it New Age Autism. I very much disagree with it. I can't see myself at all in as New Age Autism. I see myself in the way it was described in the olden days. Yeah, we got to take a whole other video. Anyway, so let me know what you think. So I'm going to move over to video number 2 now, because I want to start talking about this other article, and again, I'll probably just have to do half of it. I'm not sure, we'll just see. I don't think I'm going to be able to do the whole article in one video, but I just want to make a start on this other video, on this other article. We'll see. I might be able to, but I might not. We'll see. So I'm going to move over to video number 2 now. Okay, move over to 2.